The envelope was in her bucket. Marco Vitelli found it at 11:15 on a Thursday night, after the last table had paid and the kitchen had gone quiet, and he was doing the walkthrough he always did before locking up, checking the reservation book, straightening the bar, moving through the empty dining room the way a man moves through something he has built and is still, after 9 years, not entirely used to owning. He found it in the cleaning bucket Rosa Ferraro left by the service door every night before she went home. A plain white envelope, sealed, with his name on the front in the careful handwriting of a woman who chose every word the way you choose something that has to hold weight. Inside, one page. Folded in thirds. Mr. Vitelli. I am resigning my position effective tonight. I am sorry for the short notice. I am more sorry that I cannot explain why. Please know that working here has been the best 3 years I have had since my husband died, and that I am leaving because I have no other choice, and not because of anything you have done. Rosa. He read it twice. He stood in the empty dining room with the envelope in one hand and the letter in the other, and the restaurant quiet around him, the particular quiet of a place that has just finished being full of people and is now returning to itself, and he thought about the woman who had written it. Rosa Ferraro. 41 years old. Widowed 4 years ago when her husband Carlo had his accident on the highway outside Trenton, the one the police report called a single vehicle collision and which 3 people in this neighborhood knew was not that at all. She had a daughter, 9 years old, who she sometimes brought in on Saturday mornings when the restaurant was closed, and the child would sit at the corner table with a coloring book while her mother worked. She had been cleaning this restaurant 5 nights a week for 3 years without complaint, without incident, without ever taking a day she wasn't owed. She was the most reliable person on his payroll, and she had just resigned by letter and told him she couldn't explain why. He put the letter down on the bar. He stood with it for a moment. The easy thing, the thing available to him, the thing most employers in his position would have done, was to accept it. A cleaner had resigned with short notice and apology. The restaurant would find another cleaner. The matter was closed. He had the letter. The letter was the end of it. He was not a man who accepted the surface of things as the whole of them. He was not, specifically, a man who accepted I am leaving because I have no other choice from a person who had given him 3 years of unreserved reliability without looking at what the choice was and who had removed it. Then he went to the office and pulled up the security footage from the past 2 weeks, because he was a man who had survived in a difficult world by understanding that when something didn't make sense it was because he was missing information, and the fastest way to find information was to look at what had actually happened rather than what he'd been told. He found it in 40 minutes. A man Marco didn't recognize, entering through the service entrance on a Tuesday at 10 p.m., while Rosa was finishing the floor. Standing too close to her. Her body going very still, the stillness of someone managing fear rather than the stillness of someone at rest. The man handing her something. Rosa taking it with both hands the way you take something you're afraid to drop. The man leaving. Rosa standing alone in the empty restaurant for 2 full minutes without moving. Marco leaned back in his chair and looked at the frozen image on the screen, the man's profile, turned slightly away from the camera with the practiced ease of someone who understood where cameras were and what they could catch. He knew that posture. He knew the family it belonged to. He picked up his phone. She had cleaned his restaurant for 3 years and he had never once asked her why she was always 15 minutes early, or why she sometimes looked at the door when it opened, or why on certain nights she moved through the dining room with the careful alertness of a woman watching for something she hoped wasn't coming. He had not asked because it was not his business. It was his business now. Rosa Ferraro had grown up in this neighborhood, which meant she had grown up understanding certain things without being taught them, the way certain names carried weight, the way certain businesses functioned as more than their signs said, the way certain men moved through a room with an authority that had nothing to do with volume or display. She had absorbed this knowledge the way you absorb a language spoken around you before you are old enough to study it formally. It lived in her below the level of conscious thought, an instinct that had served her well across 41 years of living close to a world she was not part of. She had grown up on this block, attended school 12 blocks away, married a man who had grown up 4 blocks in the other direction, raised her daughter in the same apartment where she herself had been raised when her parents were still alive, and the neighborhood was slightly different in surface and entirely the same in structure. She had watched the neighborhood change and not change over 41 years, the storefronts turning over, the faces cycling, the rents climbing in the specific way of an area that the outside world had decided was worth noticing, and through all of it the underlying architecture had remained exactly what it was, which was a community organized around loyalties that predated any individual member of it and would outlast any individual member of it, and which functioned by its own codes, regardless of what happened in the world outside it. She was not part of that world. She had never been part of it. But she had lived beside it her entire life, and she understood its grammar the way you understand the grammar of a language you grew up hearing without ever speaking, well enough to follow, not well enough to navigate, and with the very specific knowledge of where the boundaries were and why crossing them was not something you did casually or without preparation. She had married Carlo Ferraro at 26. Carlo was a good man in the ways that mattered most, present, kind, genuinely funny in the quiet way that she had always found more sustaining than the performed variety, and a foolish man in exactly one way, which was the way that had ultimately killed him. He had borrowed money. Not from a bank, because the bank required a credit history he didn't have and collateral he couldn't produce, and the business he was trying to start, a small trucking operation, 2 vehicles, a contract he'd secured with a warehouse in Red Hook, needed capital on a timeline that banks couldn't accommodate. He had borrowed from people who could accommodate the timeline because they were not subject to the regulations that governed it. He had not told Rosa the full terms until the 2nd year. He had told her they had a business loan, which was true in the technical sense and insufficient in every other. He had told her the interest was manageable, which had been true when he said it and had become progressively less true in the months that followed. He had not told her the name of the person he'd borrowed from because he understood, below the level of what he was willing to articulate, that the name would produce a reaction he wasn't ready to manage. He was a man who believed problems could be solved if you worked at them hard enough, and who had believed that this problem would be solved before it became one he had to share. He had borrowed from the Serrano family. Not Aldo Serrano himself, who was the kind of man that small trucking operators did not approach directly and who would not have entertained the approach, but from a man named Gennaro who ran a loan operation out of a check-cashing place on Flatbush and who had lent Carlo the money with terms that were stated clearly and a manner that was pleasant, and an implicit understanding that the pleasantness was a courtesy extended to the transaction and not a promise about how things would proceed if the transaction went wrong. Gennaro was very good at the manner. He had cultivated it over years of lending to people who needed to believe the thing they were entering into was more benign than it was. The trucking business had done adequately for 2 years. Adequately was not sufficient. Carlo had fallen behind, and falling behind with the Serranos was a condition that compounded more rapidly than the stated rate suggested, in the way that debt to certain lenders always compounds, not through the arithmetic of the rate but through the arithmetic of what the lender can add to the principal when the borrower is not in a position to dispute the accounting. By the time Rosa had understood the full picture of what her husband had gotten them into, it was a picture she could not look at directly without the specific fear that lived in the stomach rather than the mind. Not panic, something more sustained, the fear that becomes the background of your daily life rather than an event that interrupts it. She had made Carlo promise her he would find a way out. He had promised. He had died on a highway outside Trenton on a Tuesday night in October, 4 months after the promise. The police called it a single-vehicle collision. The car had left the road on a straightaway with no weather, no mechanical failure the inspector could identify, no reason that presented itself as anything other than driver error. The straightaway was the detail Rosa had sat with for a long time after the funeral, the kind of detail that didn't fit the category and that the police had not found interesting because they were not looking for it to be interesting, and because the Serrano family was careful about what it left for police investigators to find interesting. She had sat with the detail and understood what it meant and said nothing, because saying something required going somewhere with it, and there was nowhere to go that would not make her situation significantly worse. She was a widow with a 5-year-old daughter and a debt she had inherited and people who expected payment on it, and she was not in a position to make her situation worse. She had paid down what she could. Sold Carlo's truck and applied the proceeds. Taken every available shift, cut the household to its minimum, reduced the principal by roughly a third over 2 years of sustained effort. Gennaro accepted the payments with the same pleasantness that had characterized the original transaction, which was more frightening than hostility would have been, because hostility had edges you could map while pleasantness when deployed by a man like Gennaro had no edges at all. Then, 8 months ago, Gennaro had come to her apartment on a Sunday morning with a proposition. She had opened the door because she hadn't known it was him, hadn't yet developed the particular wariness about the doorbell that she would develop shortly after, and by the time she understood who she was looking at, he was already in the hallway and moving toward the kitchen with the ease of a man who treated other people's spaces as natural extensions of his own. He sat at her kitchen table and helped himself to the coffee she hadn't offered him with the fluid confidence of someone to whom the distinction between offered and not offered had long since ceased to be interesting. He told her the remaining debt, $9,000, compounding at a rate Gennaro controlled the calculation of, could be managed in a way that would not require cash payments. That there was a service she could render. That it was simple. Something she was already positioned to do, already doing in a sense, that would require only one small additional step. She was to take money from the register at Vitelli's. He explained it with the patient specificity of a man who had given this explanation before. Small amounts, never more than 200 in a single night, never on consecutive nights, never on a pattern that would be easy to detect. She had access to the dining room, to the bar area, to the surfaces near the till during the closing procedure when the restaurant was empty and she was the last person in it. The register was reconciled against receipts in the morning by a bookkeeper who was looking for large discrepancies and not for small ones. The amounts needed only to fall within the range attributable to normal human error in cash handling, which in a busy restaurant was a range wide enough to contain what he was asking. She had the access. She had the opportunity. She had, he added with the particular quality of a compliment that wasn't, the intelligence to manage it carefully. All she needed to provide was the action. Rosa had sat across from Gennaro at her kitchen table with her coffee going cold and her daughter asleep in the next room and the Sunday morning light coming through the window over the sink, and she had thought about Carlo and the straightaway and the debt that had killed him and was now sitting across from her at her own table making a proposal about her employer's register. She had thought about Marco Vitelli, who had hired her when she said she needed work that was honest and had responded to that word as though it meant something to him. She had thought about what she would be doing to him. She had thought about Leah asleep in the next room who was 8 years old and needed her mother not to be in a situation that was worse than the current one. She had said she would think about it. Gennaro had smiled, the pleasant, patient, entirely uninflected smile, and told her she had until Wednesday. She had done it. She had told herself it was temporary, told herself she was buying time, told herself that buying time was not the same as committing. She took the money in the careful small amounts Gennaro specified, never the same night twice in a row, never a round number, always amounts that could hide inside a busy restaurant's nightly variance. She had done it for 8 months with the specific internal discipline of a person doing something they cannot bear to think about directly and have learned to perform without thinking. She had been good at it. That was its own particular punishment, the discovery that you could do a thing you believed you couldn't, and do it competently, and that the competence was not something you could separate from the thing and feel proud of in isolation. The register at Vitelli's was reconciled every morning by a man named Gio, who had been doing the books for 6 years and who was thorough without being brilliant, accurate without being perceptive. He reconciled nightly receipts against the register tape and noted variances in a column he reviewed at the end of each week. The variances Rosa produced fell within the range he attributed to human error in cash handling, a wrong count here, a missed decimal there, the small accumulated imprecision of a busy service. He had flagged it twice in 8 months. Both times Marco reviewed the column, attributed it to the same cause, and moved on. Marco had moved on because he was watching for a specific category of theft, the kind performed by people who thought they were smarter than they were. Large amounts, inventory discrepancies, patterns with obvious logic. What Rosa was doing was not that. It was the kind of thing done by someone who understood the system they were moving inside and had calibrated their intrusion precisely to what the system could absorb. He had not caught it because it was not being done carelessly. He found it now, sitting in his office at 11:30 on a Thursday night, because he was not looking for it but for something else, for the shape of Rosa's situation, for the thing that had produced the letter in the bucket. He pulled 6 months of nightly reconciliation reports and set them beside each other and looked at the variance column with the fresh attention of a man not looking for human error but for a pattern. The pattern was there. Careful, small, distributed with an intelligence he recognized, the intelligence of someone who understood risk and had managed it methodically. Never more than 180 in a single night. Never on consecutive nights. Never on a Friday or Saturday, when the evening was high volume and the register count was more likely to be checked against expectations. Midweek nights predominantly. Amounts that rounded to numbers a tired bookkeeper would accept as the kind of imprecision that happened when cash handling moved fast. It was, he recognized with a quality of attention that was not admiration but was its functional equivalent, very well done. The person who had designed this approach had understood the system they were operating inside and had calibrated their intrusion precisely to what the system could absorb without triggering a response. There was nothing careless in it. Nothing that suggested desperation or greed. It looked, viewed from a certain angle, like the work of someone who had been given parameters and had met them as exactly as possible, not exceeded them, not pushed against them, just met them with the precision of someone following instructions from a position in which following instructions precisely was the safest available option. It did not look like theft. It looked like compliance. He sat with this distinction for a long time. He thought about the woman who had written the letter in the bucket. The Saturday mornings with her daughter at the corner table. The 15 minutes early and the alertness on certain nights and the particular quality of her. The dignity, the way she moved through the restaurant with the care of someone who understood that this place was not hers but treated it as though its condition mattered to her personally. He thought about Carlo Ferraro and the highway outside Trenton and the police report that had called it a single-vehicle collision. He picked up his phone and called a man named Dino, who handled certain research functions and who answered at any hour because that was the arrangement. He gave him the description from the footage. He told him what he was looking for and why. Then he called another number. "I need to know about a woman named Rosa Ferraro," he said. "And about her husband. And about what he owed when he died." He hung up and sat in the office with the variance reports spread in front of him, the security footage frozen on the screen, and the letter from the bucket folded beside his coffee cup. He was not angry. He was a man who had learned across many years of operating in an environment where anger was a liability to sit with information until it disclosed what it required rather than reacting to the first shape it presented. The first shape was, a woman on his payroll had been stealing from him. That was accurate and insufficient. The fuller shape, assembling itself now from the evidence on the desk and the evidence on the screen and the evidence in the bucket, was, a woman whose husband had been killed by people who then inherited his debt, had been coerced into stealing from him by those same people in lieu of cash payments, had done it for 8 months, had written him a letter and resigned rather than comply with a new demand that exceeded what was manageable, and was now somewhere in Brooklyn at midnight in a situation that had not improved simply because she had removed herself from his restaurant. The fuller shape required a different response than the first shape. He waited for Dino to call back. Rosa had walked home from the restaurant for 3 years, the same route every night, down Court Street to Union, across to her block. 12 minutes she had done in every weather and season until she knew every crack in the pavement and every shop front and the way the neighborhood sounded at midnight compared to every other hour. She had always liked the walk. It was the transition between the person she was at work, efficient, invisible, doing her job in the background of other people's evenings, and the person she was at home, which was Leah's mother, the only identity that felt entirely hers. Tonight the walk felt different. She had been moving toward this decision for weeks. The new demand had arrived 2 weeks ago. Gennaro had appeared at the service entrance on a Tuesday at 10 p.m. and handed her a paper with a number on it. 400 a week instead of 200. He told her, pleasantly, that the family's needs had changed and her contribution would need to reflect that. 400 a week was not possible. She had calculated it 14 different ways and it was not possible, not within the variance limits that had kept her invisible, not within the structure of a restaurant register she understood precisely. 400 a week meant amounts that would be noticed. Being noticed meant consequences for her and for Leah that were worse than any of the current alternatives. She had said she needed time. He gave her 2 weeks. The 2 weeks had ended tonight. She had cleaned the restaurant knowing it was the last time, moving through the rooms she had memorized, every table, every corner, the way the light fell on the mahogany bar top at the end of an evening, with the attention of someone taking a final inventory. She had written the letter at home before her shift, carried it in her coat pocket, put it in the bucket at the end because she could not hand it to anyone directly. She could not have that conversation. She did not know what came next. She was walking home on a Thursday night in November with her hands in her pockets and the cold coming in off the harbor and the specific fear of a person who has made the only decision available to them and has not yet arrived at the part where the decision produces any relief. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. A number she didn't recognize. She put the phone back in her pocket and kept walking. It rang again. She stopped. She looked at the screen. She answered. Mrs. Ferraro. The voice quiet and even. She had heard it every Saturday morning when Marco Vitelli came in to review the week's bookings, or when he passed through the dining room during service and acknowledged the people who worked for him with the kind of specific attention, noticing things, cataloging things, that she had always understood, below the level of words, was not comfortable to attract if you were carrying something you didn't want noticed. She had attracted it anyway. "Mr. Vitelli," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She had always been better in crisis than in anticipation. "I got your letter," he said. "I'm sorry for the short notice." "I'm not calling about the notice." A pause, brief, the pause of a man calibrating. "I need you to come back to the restaurant." She looked at the street around her. 3 blocks from home. She thought about Leah asleep in her bed, about the woman across the hall who watched her in the evenings, about the 12-minute walk in the 2 weeks that had just ended and Gennaro and the number on the paper. "It's late," she said. "I know. Come anyway." She understood from the quality of the silence that followed that this was not a request she was being given the option to decline. Not because of threat, there was nothing threatening in his voice, there never was, but because she had spent 3 years in his space and she knew the weight of his particular kind of quietness, and the weight right now was significant. "All right," she said. She turned around. He was behind the bar when she came in through the service door. The restaurant empty, lit only by the bar lights and the low lamp over the reservation book. He had a glass of water in front of him and nothing else, which told her this was not a conversation he intended to conduct with the hospitality of the bar as a prop. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. He looked at her. "Sit down, Rosa." She sat at the nearest table, the one beside the service station, the one she had wiped down 3 hours ago, the one where she had stood when the man from the Serrano family came through the service entrance 2 weeks ago and handed her the paper with the number on it. Marco came around the bar. He did not sit across from her. He stood at the table beside her and placed on it, without announcement, a printed still from the security footage. The man. The service entrance. The paper changing hands. Rosa looked at the photograph. She looked at her hands on the table. She did not say anything. "His name is Vito Serrano," Marco said. "He works for his uncle Gennaro, who runs the loan operation on Flatbush. Your husband borrowed from Gennaro 4 years before he died." He paused. "I'm sorry about your husband, Rosa. I don't think it was an accident." She was quiet for a long time. "No," she said finally. "It wasn't." He sat down then. Not across from her, beside her, at the same table, facing the same direction. She understood this was its own form of information. He was not conducting an interrogation. He was not positioning himself as authority and her as subject. He was sitting beside her the way you sit beside someone who has been carrying something very heavy and has just put it down. "How much?" he said. She understood the question. She told him. The original debt. The monthly cash payments. The 8 months of nightly amounts. The new demand. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished he said, "How much is left on the debt?" "Gennaro says 5,000. I think it's closer to 3 with what I've paid, but he controls the accounting." "He controls the accounting," Marco repeated, with the flatness of a man noting something. "Yes." "And the new demand? 400 a week?" "Yes." "Which you can't take from this restaurant without being noticed." She looked at the table. "I could have taken it 2 months ago," she said. "At the beginning. Before the amounts added up. But she stopped." "You didn't want to," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her directly, with the dark eyes and the steady face she had spent 3 years being careful not to meet directly, because direct contact with Marco Vitelli's attention was not a casual thing and she had understood that even before tonight. "I didn't want to steal from you," she said. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he looked toward the window, the street outside where November pressed its cold and dark against the glass. "You've been doing it for 8 months, he said. "I know." The 2 words carrying everything she thought about those 8 months, the specific quality of doing something you cannot stand and cannot stop, because the alternative is worse. "Why didn't you come to me?" She looked at him. She thought about how to explain it, the arithmetic of what she'd believed her options were, the calculation she had run and rerun in the months before Gennaro's visit and in every month after. "Because I had no reason to believe it would help," she said. "I'm a cleaner." "You're a small gesture that encompassed the restaurant and everything it represented." "You don't know me." I had no claim on you. He looked at her for a long time. You've been here every night for 3 years, he said. You come early. You've never called in sick. You treat this place like it belongs to you, which it doesn't, and most people in that situation treat it like it doesn't. You don't. He put his hands flat on the table, the gesture of a man arriving at a decision already made. You had a claim. Rosa sat with this. She sat with it the way she had been sitting with things for 4 years, alone, in the middle of the night, with the weight of them pressing on her chest. She sat with it and felt something shift that she had not allowed to shift in a very long time, which was the specific weight of believing that there was no one she could tell. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried easily, and even if she had been, this was not the moment. But something in her face did something she couldn't control, a brief change in the quality of it, and she looked away toward the bar and steadied herself with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been steadying herself alone for 4 years and had gotten very good at the mechanics of it. He let her have the moment. He did not fill the silence with words, which was another thing she had noticed about him across 3 years. He understood the use of silence in a way most people didn't, which was that it was often the most respectful thing available. What happens now? She said when she had steadied. Now I make some calls, he said. And you go home to your daughter. She looked at him steadily. She thought about Gennaro and the 2 weeks that had ended tonight and what his response would be when the resignation reached him, and it would reach him, because the neighborhood was small and information moved through it the way water moved through old stone, finding every crack. She thought about 4 years of careful management of a situation that had now been handed to someone else, and she thought about whether that was a transfer she could trust. She had spent 4 years not trusting it to anyone. It's not that simple, she said. If I stop without. You've already stopped, he said. You stopped when you put that letter in the bucket. He stood. I'll handle the rest. She looked up at him. He was standing, dark eyes, a face built for gravity rather than expression, the broad controlled stillness of a man who had learned long ago that presence did not require announcement, with the quality she had spent 3 years being careful not to observe directly, the quality the restaurant organized itself around, that a room acknowledged without being told to. She was understanding it now directly, which was a different experience. Mr. Vitelli. She chose each word carefully. These are the Serranos. Gennaro's uncle Aldo has been running that operation for 30 years. He doesn't. I know who Aldo Serrano is. His voice entirely even. Not dismissive, she understood the difference. This was the evenness of a man telling you he has already accounted for the thing you are presenting as an obstacle and placed it in the correct category. She understood what category that was. She looked at his face, the gravity of it, the weight it carried without displaying the carrying, and she understood that the question of what authority he had over a situation that had consumed 4 years of her life was a question whose answer she already knew if she was willing to look at it directly. She had spent 3 years being careful not to look at it directly, because looking required acknowledging things she had preferred to keep in the peripheral category. The peripheral category was no longer available. Go home, Rosa, he said. Lock your door. Don't answer anyone you don't know tonight. She stood and put on her coat and picked up her bag. She looked at the restaurant around her, the bar, the tables, the window, the particular quality of the room at midnight when it was empty and at rest and entirely itself. She had cleaned this room 5 nights a week for 3 years. She had stolen from it for 8 months. She had written a letter rather than simply not come back. She thought those last 2 facts belonged together, and that they said something true about who she was, and that the man across the dining room had read both of them correctly. Thank you, she said. For not, she stopped. There was no clean way to finish, for not being what I feared, for sitting beside me instead of across from me, for receiving what I told you without using it against me. Thank you, she said, and left it at that, because it covered everything she couldn't say and he seemed to understand that it did. She went home. She locked her door. She checked on Leah first, her daughter asleep on her back in the specific sprawl of a 9-year-old who trusted completely that the world would hold while she was unconscious, one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress, the nightlight doing its small work in the corner. Rosa stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her. She had stood in this doorway and looked at this sleeping child on every difficult night of the past 4 years, and the looking had always produced the same thing, which was a recalibration, a return to the central fact of what mattered and what therefore had to be managed, whatever its cost. She had managed. She had managed every month of the past 4 years in the way that you manage things when you have no other option, which was one day at a time and without the luxury of seeing the full distance to the end. She went to the kitchen and sat at the table, the same table where Gennaro had helped himself to her coffee 8 months ago, and she thought about the conversation she had just had in the empty restaurant. She thought about Marco Vitelli sitting beside her instead of across from her. This was the thing she kept returning to, that specific choice, the side-by-side rather than the confrontational arrangement, the physical positioning of a man who could have made this conversation very different in tone and had chosen not to. She had been prepared for a different conversation. She had walked back through the service door prepared for the version where what she had done was what she was, where the past 8 months erased the 3 years before them and the only relevant fact was the variance reports. She had prepared herself for it on the walk back, had assembled around herself the specific composure of a person facing a consequence they have owned and intend to absorb with whatever dignity is available. She had not been prepared for being sat beside. She had not been prepared for you had a claim. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after Leah was asleep. She thought about Gennaro and the 2 weeks that had ended tonight and the fact that Marco had said he would handle the rest, and she thought about what that meant coming from a man she had spent 3 years carefully not looking at directly because looking at him directly required acknowledging things she had preferred to keep in the category of things she did not need to think about. She thought about what it meant that he had said I know who his uncle is with the particular evenness of a man who had already placed the obstacle in the correct category. She had spent 4 years believing there was no one to tell. She had spent 4 years believing that the situation was hers to manage alone because there was no one whose involvement would help rather than complicate and no one who would receive the information without using it in ways she couldn't control. She had believed this with the conviction of a person who had arrived at it through evidence, who had looked at her available options and found them to consist of exactly one, which was her own continued management of the thing, alone, indefinitely. She had been wrong. That was the part she sat with longest. Not the relief. The relief was real but it was new and she didn't entirely trust it yet, because 4 years of sustained difficulty teaches you that relief has a way of being temporary and the difficulty has a way of returning in a different form. What she sat with was the wrongness of the belief itself. 4 years of a premise that turned out to be incorrect. She did not know yet what came next. But the weight was gone. She sat with the absence of it, turning it over, learning the unfamiliar shape of a night that did not have it in it. Marco made 3 calls. The first was to Dino, who by now had the information he'd asked for. The full picture of Carlo Ferraro's debt, its original terms, its history of payment, and the current claimed balance. The claimed balance was $5,000. The documented balance, accounting for every cash payment Rosa had made over 2 years and the 8 months of nightly amounts from the register, was $1,240. Gennaro Serrano had been collecting against a debt he had reduced to a fraction of its stated size and representing it to Rosa as substantially larger, not by a small margin, not by an amount that could be attributed to disputed interest calculations, but by a factor that made it unambiguous. He had been manufacturing a number. He had also, Dino confirmed, been running this same arrangement with 2 other debtors in the neighborhood. A man who worked in a Serrano-adjacent warehouse operation in Greenpoint, performing services unrelated to his employment in lieu of cash payments on a debt whose stated balance bore no relationship to its actual one. A woman who cleaned an office building in Park Slope under similar coercion. 3 people simultaneously, none of whom knew the others existed, all of them making payments against numbers that Gennaro controlled and had no interest in reducing to zero. The scheme required the debt to remain alive. The debt remaining alive required the debtor to remain afraid. Gennaro was very good at both. Marco sat with this information for approximately 90 seconds. The picture it completed was the picture he had expected once Dino's first call had given him the outline. It did not require extended analysis. It required a decision, and the decision had been made before Dino had finished his summary. The second call was to a man named Caruso, who handled certain communications on his behalf and whose particular value was the ability to transmit information in ways that arrived with the correct weight attached. He told Caruso what needed to be transmitted and to whom and in what terms. The third call was to Aldo Serrano directly. Aldo was 64 years old and had built his operation across 30 years of careful and occasionally ruthless accumulation. He had sustained it by understanding, with the precision of a man who had studied cause and effect professionally, that certain actions produced certain consequences and that the consequences were not always recoverable from. He had not built what he'd built by being impervious to reality. He had built it by being more responsive to reality than other people. He answered on the third ring. Marco. His voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man managing a conversation he had not anticipated. Aldo. Marco's voice carrying nothing particular, just the even, unhurried quality of a man who has decided something and is in the process of communicating it. Your nephew Gennaro has been running a loan out of the Flatbush operation against a woman named Rosa Ferraro. He killed her husband 4 years ago and has been collecting against the estate since. He's been misrepresenting the balance. A silence. The woman works for me, Marco continued. She has worked for me for 3 years. She and her daughter are under my protection effective tonight. The debt, the actual remaining balance, which Dino has calculated at $1,240, will be paid in full by the end of this week. Whatever Gennaro told her she owed above that figure is a fiction and will not be honored. Another silence, this one with a different quality, the silence of rapid internal calculation. Additionally, Marco said, Gennaro has been running this same arrangement with at least 2 other debtors in the neighborhood. I'd suggest you look at that closely, because the exposure it creates is not limited to the specific people involved. Marco. Aldo's voice carefully arranged. The Ferraro situation, I wasn't aware of the specifics. I know you weren't, Marco said. This is a professional communication between people who understand each other, not an accusation. I'm telling you what I know and what the situation is going forward. The woman and her daughter are not touchable. The debt is settled as of Friday. And whatever Gennaro has been doing with the other accounts is a problem I'm giving you the opportunity to correct before it becomes a problem someone else corrects for you. He let that sit for a moment. We understand each other, Aldo said. Good, Marco said. Regards to your wife. He hung up. He sat in the quiet office for a moment after the call ended. The call had lasted 4 minutes and 40 seconds and had resolved, in 4 minutes and 40 seconds, something that had been unresolved for 4 years. This was how it worked when it worked. Not always. Not consistently. But when the right information reached the right person and was delivered in the right terms, things that had seemed immovable could be moved in the time it took to finish a cup of coffee. The right information. That was the piece Rosa had not had. She had been operating without it, without the knowledge of what Marco was, without the knowledge that he works for me could be the most consequential 4 words in that conversation, without the knowledge that there was a conversation available to her that she had not known to ask for. She had not known to ask for it because she had spent 3 years being careful not to look at him directly, and looking directly was the prerequisite for knowing that asking was possible. He thought about that. About the specific cost of the careful not looking, which had been paid not by him but by her. He sat in the office and looked at the variance reports, 6 months of them, spread across the desk, her work visible in the careful pattern of the amounts, and thought about what it had cost her to produce those. Not the money. The other cost. The nightly performance of doing something she had told him she didn't want to do, sustained for 8 months, with the discipline of someone who understood that performing it well was the only available protection and who had performed it accordingly. He thought about a 9-year-old at a corner table with a coloring book, eating a snack her mother had packed, doing her homework with the self-contained patience of a child who had learned early that the adults in her life carried things she was not old enough to be told about and that the way she could help was by not adding to the weight. He thought about the letter in the bucket. He picked up the variance reports and put them through the shredder. All 6 months. He watched the paper feed through until the column of numbers that documented 8 months of Rosa's compliance was gone. Then he closed the shredder and turned off the desk lamp and sat for a moment in the dark of the office before going home. Tomorrow he would call Dino for the final settlement confirmation. Friday the balance would be paid. Monday she would come back to work, which he believed she would, because she was a person who showed up and who had shown up for 3 years and who had left a letter rather than simply not appearing, because she understood that some obligations outlasted the circumstances that had complicated them. He was correct about all of this. He went home. She came in the following Monday. He had not called her after Thursday night, had given her the weekend deliberately, the specific mercy of not making her wait by a phone for information about a resolution she had stopped believing in. He had sent word through the appropriate channels and let the channels work, because Aldo was a careful man and careful men moved quickly when given sufficient motivation. She came in through the service door at her usual time, 15 minutes before her shift, which she had always done and apparently had not stopped doing even under the circumstances of a resignation that was, as of Monday morning, no longer operative. She came in and found Marco at the bar reviewing the week's bookings and stopped in the doorway with her coat still on and her bag on her shoulder. She looked different. Not dramatically, same coat, same bag, same Rosa. But something in her posture had shifted. Some quality of the held, braced quality she had carried for 3 years, the thing that had always been present in her like a low sustained note beneath everything else, was less present this morning. As though she had set something down over the weekend and was still discovering what it felt like to stand without it. "You're early," he said. "I'm always early," she said. "I know." He went back to the booking ledger. "There's coffee in the kitchen." She stood in the doorway for another moment. She was looking at him the way she had not looked at him for 3 years, directly, without the careful peripheral management she had always applied to their interactions, the maintenance of a distance that now, viewed from this side of Thursday night, he understood had been as much about keeping herself safe from knowing too much as it had been about professional discretion. "Is it done?" she said. He did not look up from the ledger. "The balance was paid Friday. Aldo confirmed directly that you and Leah are not to be approached by anyone from his operation. Gennaro has been removed from the Flatbush location and every other role he held." He turned a page. "So yes. It's done." A silence that had weight in it. He looked up. She had the expression of a person who has been braced against something for so long that when it is removed the removal itself requires adjustment, not relief in the simple form, not yet, just the strange steadying of a body that has been compensating for 4 years and is learning for the first time in 4 years that the compensation is no longer necessary. He had seen this before, on people for whom a resolution they had stopped believing was possible had arrived anyway. It took time to trust it. The trusting took longer than the resolution itself. This was the nature of things. He let her have the moment without filling it. He was good at this. He had learned across many years of difficult conversations that the moments after a significant piece of information landed were not moments that benefited from additional words, and that the most respectful thing he could offer was the silence to absorb it in. "The money I took," she said, when she had steadied, "is between you and whoever you decide to answer to for it," he said. "It's not something I'm carrying forward." She looked up. "That's not." "It's settled, Rosa. Flat with the quality of a closed matter. The people who put you in that position have been addressed. What you did to survive it is not the thing I'm interested in." She looked at her hands. He could see her working through it, the internal negotiation of a person with a strong sense of what she owes being told a debt is forgiven, trying to determine whether accepting that forgiveness is something she's entitled to. "I would like to pay it back," she said. "What I took. Over time." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "I'll need a raise to do it properly." He almost smiled. It arrived and was managed, the way he managed most things that arrived in his face unexpectedly, with the controlled precision of a man who had learned that expression was its own form of information. "We'll discuss the raise," he said. "I'm serious." "I know you are." He closed the booking ledger. "That's why we're discussing it." She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a moment between them, the kind that arrives in the aftermath of something significant, when the practical management has concluded and what remains is the simple fact of 2 people on the other side of an experience that has changed the nature of the space between them. He was aware of it. He believed she was too. Neither of them did anything with it, because it was 11 o'clock on a Monday morning and she had a shift to begin and he had a restaurant to run, and certain things were better acknowledged by being set aside to return to at a more appropriate moment. She was a woman who understood timing. He was a man who understood patience. Between the 2 of them the moment was noted and held without being pressed into something it wasn't yet ready to be. She picked up her bag and went to the supply closet for her equipment and began the shift. He heard her moving through the dining room, the specific sound of her, the economy of it, no wasted motion, nothing performed for an audience that wasn't there. He had heard this sound for 3 years and registered it without attending to it, the way you register the right sounds as the background of a space that is functioning correctly. He attended to it now. He went back to the reservation book and turned pages without reading them and thought about what had changed and what had not changed and what the difference was between the two. The restaurant was the same restaurant. Her job was the same job. She would show up 15 minutes early and work with the care she had always worked with and leave at the same time she had always left, and the surface of things would be, for most practical purposes, what it had been for 3 years. The surface of things was not the whole of things. He had always known this. He had built a life and a business on the understanding that surfaces were the beginning of information and not the end of it. The surface said, employer and employee, professional relationship, clear boundary, no complications. The full picture, which he now had, said, a woman who had spent 8 months doing something she didn't want to do and had written a letter rather than disappear, who had said I didn't want to steal from you in the specific tone of someone naming the most important fact, who had come back on a Monday at her usual time after being told it was done, because showing up was what she did. He was not entirely sure what to do with the full picture. He was a man who preferred to understand a situation completely before moving within it, and he was still understanding this one. He was patient. He would give it the time it needed. He went back to the reservation book. She moved through the dining room with the sound he had always heard and had not always attended to, and the restaurant around them proceeded with the ordinary business of a Tuesday morning getting ready to become a Tuesday afternoon, and outside on Court Street the neighborhood went about its November life with the complete indifference to individual circumstances that neighborhoods maintain regardless of what is happening inside the buildings that line them. He turned another page. He was not reading it. She brought Leah in that Saturday morning. This was not unusual. She had done it on most Saturdays for 2 years, when the restaurant was closed and she could work without the pressure of an evening service. Leah would sit at the corner table with her books and her drawing pad and her snack, occupying herself with the self-contained quality of a child who has spent significant time in adult spaces and has learned to be comfortable in them without demanding attention. But this Saturday Marco was in. He was not usually there on Saturdays. He was there because Dino had sent over the final documentation on the Serrano settlement and he wanted to review it in his office without a weekday's interruptions. He was coming out of the office when he nearly walked into Leah Ferraro in the hallway. She was small for 9, slight, with her mother's dark eyes and her mother's quality of attentiveness, the quality of a child accustomed to being in the world a little more carefully than most children are required to be. She was wearing a blue sweater and had a drawing pad under one arm and a marker in her hand, and she looked up at him without the flinching that some children produced when they encountered him, the involuntary recognition, in adults and children alike, of a man whose quality of presence required some adjustment. She looked at him with assessment rather than alarm. It reminded him of something, and after a moment he understood what. It reminded him of her mother, who had looked at him on Thursday night with the same quality, assessment without performance, taking inventory of what was actually there rather than reacting to what she had been afraid might be there. "You're the owner," she said. "I am," he said. "My mom says you're fair," she said. He looked at her. What does she mean by that? She considered this with the seriousness of a child who had been asked a genuine question and intended to give a genuine answer. "She means that you pay people what they are owed and you don't ask for things that aren't yours." She paused. "She says that's harder than it sounds." He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother is right," he said. "It is harder than it sounds." She nodded as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. Then she looked at him with the frank appraisal of a child who has not yet learned to disguise appraisal as something more socially acceptable, conducted her final assessment, apparently reached a satisfactory conclusion, and went back to her corner table. He stood in the hallway for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he went to the kitchen and made 2 cups of coffee and a cup of hot chocolate, from the good chocolate, the one they used for the dessert menu in winter, not the powder that sat on the staff shelf, and brought them out on a tray. He set the hot chocolate in front of Leah, who looked at it and then up at him. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's a Saturday morning and it's cold outside and you're sitting at a table without anything to drink. I made an inference." She thought about this with the same careful consideration she brought to everything. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." He took the 2 coffees to the bar, where Rosa had appeared from the back with the expression of a woman who has just witnessed something that has rearranged her internally and is in the process of deciding what to do with that. He set 1 coffee in front of her. She looked at it. She looked at him. "She said you were fair," she said. "She told me." "She tells people what she thinks," Rosa said. I've never been able to stop her. Don't stop her, he said. He picked up his own coffee. It's a good quality. Rosa looked at him for a moment. The direct look, the one she had been carefully not directing at him for 3 years, and that had become, since the conversation at the bar on Thursday, simply the way she looked at him. Without the carefulness. Something had shifted in the space between them in ways that the resumption of normal daily function had not reversed. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. Why did you help me? She said it without challenge, a genuine question, the kind she asked when she wanted accurate information. You didn't have to. I stole from you. You could have. There were a lot of things you could have done that weren't this. He thought about how to answer this honestly. He thought about the letter in the bucket and the 3 years of 15 minutes early and the corner table on Saturday mornings and the sound of her in the restaurant at closing, moving through the space with the care of someone who had decided that things in her custody deserved to be treated well. You've been in this restaurant for 3 years, he said. You came in frightened and you never showed it, and you did your job every night without complaint, and you treated this place like it mattered. Not because you had to. Because you decided it did. He set his cup down. People who decide things matter, they are worth something. I'm not interested in what the Serranos made you do. I'm interested in what you decided. She was quiet for a long time. Then she looked at her daughter at the corner table, drawing something with great concentration, the marker moving across the page with the decisive strokes of a child who was confident in her vision. 3 years ago, Rosa said, when I came in for the interview. You asked me why I wanted the job. Do you remember what I said? He remembered. You said you needed work that was honest. You hired me the same day. She looked back at him. I knew then, I think, that you were the kind of person who understood why that mattered. He was quiet for a moment. Then, did you know then that you were going to end up taking from the register? No. She said it without flinching. That came later. And every night I did it, I thought about that interview and I thought about what I'd said, and she stopped. It was the worst part. That it was here. He looked at her steadily. Is that why you wrote the letter instead of just not coming back? She met his eyes. I couldn't disappear on you without explaining. Even if I couldn't explain. He held her gaze. Outside the restaurant, November pressed its particular weight against the windows, grey and cold and dense, the kind of morning that drove people inward. The restaurant was warm. The coffee was hot. In the corner, Leah was drawing something with great concentration, the marker moving with the decisive confidence of a child who knew exactly what she was making. Rosa, he said. She waited. Have dinner with me, he said. Not here. Somewhere else. Some evening when you're not working. She looked at him for a long moment. He watched the things that moved through her face, the surprise, managed quickly, the assessment, not rushed, and then something else, the thing that came after the assessment when it returned with a particular answer. That would change things, she said. Some things should change, he said. She turned her coffee cup by the handle, the movement of a person thinking. Then she looked at him with the direct, unadorned attention that was the most fundamental thing about her. Thursday, she said. I don't work Thursdays. I know, he said. I made the schedule. She almost smiled. It arrived at the corner of her mouth and was almost immediately managed, but not quite in time. He caught it. He thought it was the best thing he had seen in this restaurant in 9 years of owning it. Thursday, he said. What happened to Gennaro Serrano was not dramatic. It was administrative, which in many ways was worse. Administrative consequences had a specific quality that dramatic ones lacked. They were quiet, they were complete, and they had no moment at which the person receiving them could demonstrate courage or defiance or any of the other qualities that dramatic consequences permitted. There was simply a series of closed doors. A set of roles that were no longer his. A silence where there had been activity. The particular erasure of a man who had built his operation on other people's fear, finding that the infrastructure of that fear had been dissolved by a single phone call between 2 men he could not reach and could not appeal to and could not leverage against each other because there was nothing to leverage. Aldo, presented with the documentation of what Gennaro had been running, the manufactured balances, the coerced labor arrangements, the multiple debtors managed through the same mechanism, conducted his own audit with the thoroughness of a man who had discovered that a member of his organization had been creating liability he hadn't authorized. The audit confirmed everything and a great deal more besides. Gennaro was removed from the Flatbush operation and every other role within the Serrano family's infrastructure. This was communicated to him on a Friday morning in a room above a social club on Nostrand Avenue, by his uncle, who sat across from him with the audit documentation and the specific quality of stillness that Aldo Serrano used when he had already made a decision and was in the process of delivering it rather than discussing it. Gennaro had spent the meeting trying to find an argument. He was an intelligent man and he understood arguments, the construction of them, the identification of leverage, the particular framing that made an untenable position look negotiable. He had spent his professional life inside the architecture of other people's fear, which meant he understood how power worked and where the pressure points were and how to apply them. He could not find the pressure point. There was no argument available because there was no version of the documentation in front of Aldo that Gennaro could reframe. The numbers were the numbers. 3 debtors. Manufactured balances. A dead man's estate. And a woman who worked for Marco Vitelli, which was the sentence that ended every argument before it began. He walked out of the room on Friday morning with the complete knowledge of what had just happened to him, and he drove to the apartment in Bensonhurst, and he sat in his car outside it for a long time before going in. The practical outcome was that he was no longer in a position to approach anyone in the neighborhood about anything. The other 2 debtors running similar arrangements were also quietly released from their obligations, their actual balances settled, their situations regularized. This was done without announcement. It was simply done. Aldo Serrano was a careful man. He understood that the goodwill of Marco Vitelli was worth more than the revenue Gennaro's scheme had been generating, and he understood that the scheme had been generating liability rather than net revenue once you accounted correctly for what it had been costing. He was not sentimental about Gennaro. He was practical about Gennaro. They were different things that arrived at the same outcome. Marco was outside her building at 7 on Thursday evening. He had made a reservation across the bridge, a small restaurant in the village he had eaten in twice and trusted. Not flashy, not loud, the kind of place that understood the point of a good dinner was the dinner and the person across from you and not the statement made by the room. He had dressed without making a production of it, which was how he dressed for everything. She came out at 7 exactly, in a dark coat he hadn't seen her in before, with her hair down instead of the way she wore it for work. She looked different in the way that people you see always in one context look different in another. The same person, a fuller version, the parts of her that the restaurant edited out now present and visible. She looked at him on the sidewalk. He looked at her. "You're on time," she said. "I'm always on time," he said. "I know," she said. "I noticed." There was a brief moment, the kind that arrives and passes before either person decides what to do with it, and then she moved toward the car and he walked beside her and they were both slightly aware of the small logistics of an evening beginning, which was its own kind of information. He opened her door. She accepted this without comment. She was a person who received things gracefully when offered gracefully, who did not perform gratitude or perform discomfort, who accepted what was offered and returned to the business of being present. Consistent with everything else he knew about her. In the car she was quiet for a few minutes, watching the city go by. Brooklyn organizing itself around them as he drove, the familiar streets, the familiar buildings, the neighborhood that had contained both of their lives for long enough that it had become the grammar of their daily existence, the background without which other things didn't quite make sense. "She drew you a picture," Rosa said. He glanced at her. "Leah. Last Saturday. She spent the whole morning on it and told me to give it to the owner." Rosa reached into her bag and held out a folded piece of drawing pad paper. He took it at the next red light and opened it. It was a drawing of his restaurant. He understood immediately, because the corner table was there and the bar was there and the front window was there, rendered in the decisive strokes of a child who drew the world as she saw it rather than as she thought it should look. At the bar, 2 figures. One taller, one shorter. The taller one had a coffee cup. The shorter one had a coloring book. Underneath, in the careful printing of a child taught to form her letters well, "Thank you for the hot chocolate." He looked at the drawing for a moment. Then he refolded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket. Rosa was looking out the window. "She likes you," she said. "I like her," he said. "She told me you were fair." "I told you she tells people what she thinks." "She's right," he said. "About the fair." Rosa was quiet for a moment. The bridge ahead of them. The lights of the city on the water below. the night enormous and dense around them. "So are you," she said quietly. Not looking at him, looking at Brooklyn going past the window, the lights in the brownstone windows, November doing what it did. "I wasn't sure. I knew it in the interview, and then when everything happened I couldn't see you clearly anymore because I was too afraid to look at you clearly. But you are." He drove. He did not fill the space she'd left. "I spent 3 years trying to be invisible to you," she said. "Which I know how that sounds now. Given that you noticed anyway." "I noticed," he said, "when there was something to notice. Before that I noticed you the way you notice things that are working correctly, by not having to think about it." She turned from the window and looked at him. He could feel the weight of it without turning. "And now," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The bridge, the lights on the water, the night opening up ahead. "Now," he said, "I'm taking you to dinner." She was quiet for another moment. Then she turned back to the window and he heard, in the small shift of her posture, the quality that had been in her face on Saturday when the almost smile arrived, the managed thing that didn't quite get managed in time. He looked at the road ahead and thought about 3 years of early arrivals and a letter folded in thirds in a cleaning bucket and a child in a hallway who had looked at him without flinching and told him her mother said he was fair. He thought about the 3 years themselves, the shape of them now that he could see them from this angle, this car, this bridge, with Rosa Ferraro in the passenger seat looking at the lights on the water. He had owned the restaurant for 9 years and run it well and taken a certain satisfaction in the running of it that had always been primarily professional. The right table turned at the right time, the right supplier, the right staff. The satisfaction of something functioning correctly. Rosa had been part of what functioned correctly. He had registered this without examining it, for 3 years, the way you register the things that are working as they should, gratefully and without dwelling, because dwelling was reserved for what was broken. What had happened in the past week was not a functional matter. He thought about the letter in the bucket. The specific decision to write it rather than simply not return. To explain without explaining, to say I have no other choice and it is not because of anything you have done and sign it with only her name. He thought about what that decision said about the person who had made it, the refusal to disappear on him without acknowledgement, the refusal to let the last 3 years be erased by what the last 8 months had required. He thought that was the most important thing about her. Not the 15 minutes early or the Saturday mornings or the way she moved through the dining room. The letter. The decision to be accountable even for a situation she had been coerced into. That was the kind of person you didn't find very often. The bridge carried them across the water. The city opened up ahead of them on the other side. Different borough, same night, the same enormous November dark pressing down on the lights below it. Brooklyn receded behind them and held its long watch. The streets and the buildings and the families inside them and the restaurant on Court Street with its lights off and its tables clean and the corner table empty and ready for Saturday morning. He drove. She watched the lights on the water. She was thinking about the drawing in his breast pocket. The 2 figures at the bar, one with a coffee cup, one with a coloring book, rendered in the decisive strokes of a 9-year-old who drew the world as she actually saw it rather than as convention suggested it should be represented. Leah had spent a Saturday morning on that drawing. Had folded it carefully and told Rosa to give it to the owner. Had not explained why, because she was a child who understood that some communications were complete in themselves and did not require annotation. Rosa thought that Leah had seen something that Saturday morning that Rosa herself had not yet been willing to see directly. Children were often faster at the direct seeing. They had not yet developed the elaborate apparatus of indirection that adults use to protect themselves from clarity. She was done with the indirection. She had been done with it since Thursday night, since the bar at midnight, since the side-by-side instead of the across from. She had been done with it since Monday morning when she had come back not knowing if she would and had found him there with the booking ledger and the specific quality of a man who had expected her and had not made a thing of the expecting. The city moved past the window. The bridge fell away behind them. Ahead, the village was doing what the village did on a Thursday evening. Lit and warm and populated with the specific energy of a neighborhood that understood its own character and inhabited it with confidence. Neither of them said anything else, because some evenings are better served by the city moving past the window and the warm quiet of a car carrying 2 people who have arrived, after a longer route than either planned, by a more complicated path than either would have chosen, at the beginning of something that had been true for a while before either of them had been willing to look at it directly. The most reliable person on his payroll. 3 years of early arrivals. A letter in a cleaning bucket, folded in thirds, that had told him everything he needed to know about who she was and what she was worth. He drove. She watched the lights.